All right. Okay. Tonight's shir I'll try to relate to the going ons of our holiday season because there's actually a lot related in Sefer Yehoshua. There's a lot related to what we have been doing and what we're going to be doing. Namely, in the Battle of Jericho, the Battle of Jericho. When we last left off, we had these very interesting battle plans, which we were instructed through God, from God to Yehoshua and to the people. There's a city of Jericho, which is a super fortified city. It was one of the most fortified cities in the whole land. And they had these very interesting instructions. And I'd like to ask you about them. You have 7 Kohanim, take 7 shofars, right? One in each Kohan's hand. And then first you send out the fighters, Reuben and Gad, and half of Manasseh. They go out in the front lines. And then behind them, you have the Kohanim. Behind them you have the nation, the rest of the nation. Then the Kohanim and the ark. And behind them, you have the tribe of Dan, interestingly. The tribe of Dan is called the Me'asef, the collector. If you want to see that inside, it's an interesting note over here. Where's the Me'asef? That's one of the places it's in verse number 13. It talks about the gatherer or the Me'asef. The tribe of Dan always in the desert, and also here in this case, they always traveled in the very back. They're the ones who gathered in the stragglers. If anybody dropped any objects while they were traveling, Shevet Dan was like the sweeping crew. You know, they picked up the final things. Do you have the translation there, David? How do they translate? In chapter 6, verse number 13. It's
Well, the 7 priests,
You want me to read it?
here, Mr. Michelle's reading it for us. Well, the 7.
Okay.
while the 7
There you go. Okay, so they translate it as the rear guard. That's interesting. And the Hebrew word is Me'asef, which is just like a collection. We're about to actually enter Chag HaAsif when we gather in the produce from our field. So, but they're translating it because that's really a commentary more than a translation, because they went in the back. That's the idea. And that was the tribe of Dan. And here are the unique instructions. You have this lineup. The entire Jewish people are there. And their instructions are, once a day for 6 days, you go around the city, blow the shofar 1 time, and everybody remains silent the entire time. Yeah, they do 1 circuit around, 1 hakafa. They go once, they blow the shofars, silence, and they go back to their camp in Gilgal. The day 2, they do the same thing. Day 3, 4, 5, 6, until finally the 7th day, they go around 7 times. They blow a tekiah gedola. Then the entire nation is instructed to cry out, tariu, which either means that they cried out or that they blew their own shofars. I saw 2 different ways of understanding in the commentaries. Because teruah can mean a cry, but could also just mean a teruah blast from a shofar. Everybody shouts out together during the tekiah gedola, and the walls come tumbling down. So, a few familiar elements over here. First of all, we have the shofros, which is very familiar around this time of year. And this is perhaps one of the origins of the tekiah gedola, the long blast, which was the final blast they blew before the walls came down. What's the idea behind a long blast? Second question is, what's the idea with the 7 days, the 7 circuits, the 7 shofars, 7 kohanim? Clearly, the number 7 here is very significant.
They blow the shofar on the Sabbath?
What'd you say?
They blow the shofar on the Sabbath?
Yes, they blew the shofar on the Sabbath. This was technically is permitted on a Torah level. The fact that they even went to war on the Sabbath was because when it comes to life and death, and when it comes to fighting a war, which is a mitzvah, you're allowed to do that on Shabbos. It overrides Sabbath observance. Yeah. Interesting to consider their first. Would this be their first Shabbat? I guess it was to be their second Sabbath in Israel, and they're already fighting wars on the Sabbath. Yeah. No time for cholent, for challah. They're already in the war. Not much of a war, though, as we know, right? They didn't have to do much fighting. One question I'd like to, so we have a few questions on the table. What's with the 7 circuits? What's with the long blast at the end? Tkiya Gedola, which has made it into our services. At the end of Yom Kippur, we blew a Tkiya Gedola, more or less. At the end of Rosh Hashanah, we blow a Tkiya Gedola, a long blast. And here along with Tkiya Gedola, what's the deal with that? And the first question I'd like to put out to you, my dear friends, is what's with the silence? The instructions are very specific. For each of the 6 days, you go around one time, but keep completely silent. Nobody make a sound, just the shofar blast, and then go back to your tents. What do you think is the significance of that? Why would the nation have to be silent? Well, let them schmooze, let them yell, talk, whatever. There was specific instructions, don't make any sound for the entire 6 days.
You want the technical answer?
Yeah, go ahead.
There is a technical answer. A sound can disrupt things. So the Memorex commercial where they break the glass, very well known.
Yeah.
But if you have the sound of the shofar, you walk around the city and you start the destruction process going. You weaken some pieces and you gradually weaken some pieces over the 6 days. Now, if you start yakking and talking and have other sounds there, you dilute the focus of the acoustics.
Very nice.
That's the technical side.
Very nice. Excellent.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I dare say it's technical, but I also think it's very meaningful. Like in shul, right, the most quiet part of the service, the silent Amida, the Shemona Esrei, which we recite, that's because we were in complete union with God at that very moment. We're standing so close to him, as it were, so to speak, that we only have to let out a whisper and he's there. So here, there's something, aside from this disrupting the sound, there's the very experience itself, which demands a silence around it, holy time. I think you're right about the technical thing. It's going to distract from the shofar. And the idea, I think, is because the Navi wants us to be focused on the shofar sound. The entire Jewish people, they're instructed, don't make any sounds. We want the people of Jericho to hear it, but we also want you to hear it. So I touched on briefly last time that the idea of a shofar, if it's a straight blast, the first time we had a long straight blast of a shofar, anybody recall when that is? A long straight shofar.
Against Stumbalik, was it?
Close. No, I don't think there was a shofar there though, as far as I recall, but it's around that time. Let's call it the most significant event in history of the world.
Oh, Sinai.
Sinai.
Yeah.
There you go. At Mount Sinai, the entire experience leading up to God's revelation was a loud, continuous shofar blast. One long tekiah, continuous shofar blast. And the idea is that a continuous blast represents the kingship of Hashem. When he wants to crown the king, you blow a shofar in a clear, straight blast. That's how they would crown kings in the days of yore. So too at Har Sinai, when the king was arriving on the mountain, so to speak, when God was coming down upon the mountain, there was a long shofar blast.
Yes. Yeah.
There you have it. Yeah. So that is perhaps the first, and all the people trembled. Because what's the trembling from? It's the awe, right? Aside from the loud booming sound, there's the awe of the king coming and bringing his presence down. Similarly here, this is a very miraculous thing that's about to occur. When you're dealing with open miracles, that means God, so to speak, is coming closer to our place down here on earth. So those shofar blasts, perhaps, are symbolizing the descent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kivyachol, of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, down into our realm, until they finally rest on the very walls of Jericho and make them go and get sucked down into the ground. You know, the Talmud says that this is probably more metaphoric and symbolic, metaphysical, if anything. There are 7 layers of heaven, of Shemayim. And the Talmud goes into details of what each one is called. You have the first one is the Vilon, which is just a basic curtain, and then you have the rakia, and above that you have the shechakim, and each one has its own name and its own purpose. And there's 7 different layers of Shemayim. And God, of course, dwells above them all. The highest one, interestingly, is known as the Aravos, which we're going to be meeting soon on Sukkot, the Aravos. But either way, so now that means when the Shekhinah has to come down, it has to descend through these 7 levels. So it could be that those 7 blasts for 7 days were representing the descent of the divine presence onto the walls of Jericho. And that's why we have to be as quiet as we are during a Shemona Esrei, right? That God is coming down right amongst us, which is a pretty powerful thing. Now, of course, you recognize the custom of going around something once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day you go around 7 times, right? It's a very timely riddle. Once a day for 6 days, and then the 7th day go around 7 times. Those are the hakafos we do on Sukkot. Every single day, we take out our lulav and esrog, we surround the Sefer Torah once in the shul. On the 7th day, Hoshana Rabbah, which is going to be next Sunday, not this coming one, you go around 7 times. Exactly what happened at Jericho.
Yes, however,
Yeah.
on Shabbat, you don't.
That's true. On Shabbat, you don't. And the truth is, in the temple, they would even do it on Shabbat. In the temple itself, they would even do it on Shabbat. Not doing it on Shabbat is a later restriction that they applied because they were afraid people would be carrying their lulav and esrog in a place without an eruv. But in the temple times, they would actually do it in the temple. They would do it on Shabbat. They would circle the mizbeach, even if it was Shabbos. Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's a good point, but it's only relevant nowadays. So the idea is, here you have the divine presence coming down to subjugate our enemies. So too, on Sukkot, we have all these negative forces are trying to pass. Ana Hashem Moshiach, God save us from the bad winds that are going to come and destroy our crops or diminish our water supply, which is the time we're being judged on water, is Sukkot. You have the descending sacrifices that we're bringing for the nations throughout the holiday of Sukkot, that if they have any illusion that they have power, that we're diminishing that as the days go by, to diminish that illusion, and in the end it will just be God standing on his own. So it's again representing the descent of the divine presence into our world and the subjugation of any evil forces that want to combat Hashem's presence. That is a little bit, a smidgen of the symbolism of 7 circuits bringing down God's presence, as it were.
Very good.
Yeah, okay.
Never knew that.
Now there's a technical issue here. Do you remember, we actually know the identity of one of the residents of Jericho. Can you name one person who lived in Jericho in the times of Yehoshua in biblical Israel? One resident, perhaps the most famous resident of Jericho. Yeah, Rachav, Rehav, the Zona, who we met when the spies first went in, the very opening chapter of Yehoshua. And then when the spies first went into Israel, they met this lady, Rachav Azona. And how did they escape from her house? You recall? She let them down the window because she lived on the wall of the city. So now we have a problem on our hands, because you remember the promise they made to her was, we're not going to destroy you and your family. Just stay in your house, tie this little string over here, and you're not going to get destroyed. And yet now we're seeing that all the walls get swallowed into the ground. So how could you protect Rachav on the one hand while destroying her house on the other hand? Is her house on the wall or is it not on the wall? Do you hear the technical issue here? If Rachav lived on the wall of the city, then we have one suggestion here that part of the wall did not collapse. Yes. That's very good. That later in our chapter, it's going to say, in verse number 22, chapter 6, it says, Bo Beit Ha'isha Azona, come into the house of that lady and save her and fulfill your promise. So apparently her house was still intact even after the walls had fallen. So from here, the Radak writes that we maybe in our minds picture that all of the walls of Jericho came down. He writes, no, it was just the walls that were opposite the Jewish people. Like they finished the circuit, and now they're standing, let's say, against the eastern side of the wall. I don't know which side. And that the eastern side came down, and then the Jews were able to enter and take the city. But it doesn't mean that all the walls came down. That's one approach. But I must tell you, that left me feeling empty because in my mind, Jericho was that all the walls came and got swallowed into the ground. So I did find the Malbim writes that perhaps Rachav's house was situated close to the wall, but it was only one of the walls of Rachav's house. So if the walls come tumbling down, okay, so now she's got like a porch instead of a bedroom. It's an open porch. She just lost one wall of her house, but the rest of the walls were intact. That's the Malbim's approach to deal with that technical issue. But indeed, they did save Rachav, of course, as is explicit over here. And I must tell you, we mentioned this before. I want to show you where it is now. Where did she go? Yeah. If you take a look in verse number 23, it says, "Vayavo hane'arim hameraglim." The young boys who were spies came and took out Rachav and her father and mother and her brothers and everything that belonged to her, as they promised. So first of all, why are they being called young boys? We're talking about Pinchas and Kalev. They were two esteemed people from the nation. So Rashi says, since they had to act very quickly, they were like young boys because their alacrity in doing this task, they're referred to as young boys. They're not literally young, not young in age, I should say. But it says at the end of that verse in 23, it says, "Vayanichum michutz lamachane Yisrael," and they placed Rachav and her family outside of the Jewish camp. But if you take a look in the very 2 verses later, number 25, "Ve'es Rachav azon of his beis aviyah, ve'es kol asher la," Rachav and her family and everything that belonged to her, Hecheya Yehoshua gave it life, but Teshev Bekerev Yisrael, and they sat in the midst of the Jewish people. Seems to be a contradiction here. Were they placed outside of the camp, as it says in verse 23, or was Rachav and her family in the midst of the Jewish people? What are we to make of that? Do you appreciate this contradiction? Where did Rachav and her family go? Did they save her but leave her outside the camp? Or like in verse 25, did they actually bring her into the camp?
Well, when it says camp, it could be, if Bnei Israel surrounded Jericho, then there would be normally, it's a siege warfare. Normally, you would have a lot of soldiers inside the old original walls of Jericho.
Yeah.
And when you said, but they were removed outside the camp, that would maybe put them back with the women and children of Bnei Israel, further away from the center of Jericho.
I see, a very pragmatic approach. I mean, outside the camp means away from the fighters. Leave them in the back lines. Very nice. Until later, it was time to bring them in again. I like that approach. I'll tell you something remarkable I saw. The Malbim says that when the spies first came, this is a different resolution to this question that we just raised. Was she placed outside the camp or inside the camp? The Malbim says, back in chapter 2, when the spies first came to Rachav, she said, we all are terrified of the Jewish people, and we recognize that God is Elohim. He is the ultimate power. The Malbim says at that point, she had just converted. That statement is actually a reference, an allusion to the fact that she converted on the spot. She decided she wanted to become a Jew. So she had converted, but her family not. So it went like this. When they first saved Rachav and her family, they put them outside the camp and they said, listen, your lives are saved. If anybody wants to join the Jewish people, you have time to consider conversion, and then we'll absorb you into our people. We'll take you into our midst. But otherwise, right, we'll let you go on your way. So at first they were placed outside the camp. And then later it says, Hecheya Yehoshua. Yehoshua gave them life. What does that mean? This is the most remarkable Shidduch perhaps to take place. The very first Shidduch, the leader of the Jewish people, Yehoshua ben Nun, gave life to Rachav and her family. That means that he married Rachav. That's what the sages learned. He married Rachav. He so appreciated her ability to stand against the grain, to go against the grain, do the opposite of what everybody else was doing. And he married her. That's coming from that word in verse number 25, that he gave her life. I don't know how they translate it in English. And then the idea is,
Only we have along with all that belong to her and to walk among Israel.
Yeah.
As is still the case. For she has despised that Joshua sent her.
yeah. So they don't translate that word hechaya, but that's the word that Chazal are taking from. Among, yeah, to dwelling among. The idea here is once Joshua had married her, people had realized, whoa, this is not just a bunch of stragglers that we offered a favor to. This is now in a very important family. They just became royalty. So everyone said, hey, come on in, fellas, and they all decided to convert and join the Jewish people, in addition to Rachav. So this is a remarkable shidduch that had been made back then, which is remarkable to consider. Rachav, I was trying to think, what is the special quality which attracted Yehoshua? There are many good girls out there. This lady was known to be a prostitute. Her inn was the place where everybody came to hear the latest gossip. And like her, you're going to take her? Like, okay, she's a nice lady, but you're the leader of the Jewish people. Maybe, you should try somebody in a different league. So perhaps it's exactly because of that he wanted her, because what did we see Rachav doing? Rachav, which means expansive, wide. That's the word Rachav means, her name. Is because she knew everybody, she knew all the gossip. Everybody had known her, biblically, as we say. Yeah. And now, when the spies came and she recognized the power of Hashem and the truth of the Torah and God, she went completely against her nature. She concealed information. She concealed the spies. She helped them. She snuck them out. She's doing the exact opposite of everything. Exact opposite of what she normally does naturally. And why? Because that was the truth. That ability and appreciation, that passion and drive to commit to the truth, even if it's completely against everything you've been doing until now, to go a complete 180, l'shem shemaim, for the sake of heaven. Perhaps I'm just speculating. Maybe that was a part of why Yeshua chose to marry her. Okay. There is a technical issue here. I'm not sure if anybody wants. Oh yeah, a question on the table. Go ahead.
I think my first impression when I read it years ago was that she was a traitor to her own society. I couldn't.
That's true. Yeah, she certainly was a traitor in terms of the king of Jericho, who's probably not happy with her. Yes.
Right. The only thing I can think of is if the people of Jericho were destroyed because they were terrible sinners.
Right.
They couldn't.
Imagine those Germans and Polish people who against the law took Jews into hiding during the Holocaust. In a sense, they're traitors, right? The government said you're not allowed to do this, and they did it anyway. So
well,
yeah,
they're
traitors, but they're doing it because
not
that's
the Polish, but the Germans for sure would be traitors.
yeah,
that's true.
Right.
Yeah.
So we appreciate that sometimes there's a good reason to be a traitor. Yeah, depends.
Okay.
You have to put your allegiances with the right team. That's it.
I like that explanation. Thank you. Are the people in Jericho had to be very, very bad for God to let them be killed. But on the other hand, we also know that good people get killed in our world.
Absolutely, certainly in times of war, there's
right, and
unfortunately no discrimination.
right.
As far as our eye can see it, we do know, as our parsha says, "Hatzur tamim pa'alo ki chol derachav mishpat." Our rock, his work is perfect, and all of his ways are just. So there are many questions that we have in this world, and it does seem like innocent people die. But we know in the bigger picture, it does make sense. But you're absolutely right that as far as we could see, even innocent people die during wartime. I will say though, the opening line, I think it's of chapter 6, is that Jericho, the city Jericho, was sogeret umisugeret, closed and closed, exceedingly closed. And the commentaries say that this was a fortress of impurity. It was so closed off from the light of Hashem that the light of truth and divinity could not penetrate the walls of Jericho. It was such a wretched place. We really are dealing with a very awful and morally corrupt city. So that if that helps, settle our nerves about the war business. Again, God is the one who can determine who deserves life and not. It's not our cheshbon. Okay, I want to touch on a couple of points here. So many goodies, but let's just focus on maybe the bigger ones. Okay, but there's jumping back a little bit to verse number 17. It says, "V'haita ir cherem hi v'chol asher ba la'Hashem." The city and everything in it should be consecrated to God. Cherem means it's set aside for God, and nobody else can benefit from it. All the spoils of war, anything that was left over from the city, forbidden for anybody to benefit from. This is going to be essential information. Soon we're going to see that there was one Jew who did take from the spoils. But so what's the idea? Why did they make it cherem? There's no instructions from God for Yehoshua to do this. This was Yeshua's initiative. Joshua decided the spoils from this war, we're going to give it all to God. We're not going to take a penny for ourselves. Not one necklace, not one pendant, nothing that we find will belong to the Jewish people. Why? Why did Joshua do that? And we see that God agreed to Joshua's decision because later he punished the Jews for actually taking the spoils, as we'll see in the coming weeks, God will. So there are a few beautiful ideas. The Radak writes, this was the first city that they conquered in Israel. And we know that the Torah makes a big deal about every first. When a person has a firstborn, dedicate him to God. You have to exchange him with Pidyon Ben with the Kohen. When a person shears his sheep for the first time, you give the initial shearings to the Kohen, the man of God. You take the first fruits and you bring them to the temple to dedicate them to God. And so on and so forth. Every time we have the beginning of something, we always want to include God in the beginning of the process, as if to say, God, we appreciate that everything that we're going to get from here on out is from you. And therefore I give you my very first dollar, so to speak. Right? Like when a business opens, they put the first dollar on the wall. We take the first dollar and we put it in the pushkin, the tzedakah box, and dedicate it to Hashem. So here, Jericho was that very first dollar. This is the first piece of Israel that we captured. We're going to give all of the spoils to God. It's like teruma. That's the first idea behind it. The second is, the Malbim writes, who fought this war? The Jews had no input whatsoever. All they did was blow a shofar, and God did the rest. So Malbim says, God fought the war, God gets the spoils. This all belongs to Hashem. And that works out very nicely. We'll see in the coming wars, in the coming battles that the Jews will undertake, they will take some of the spoils because they had more of involvement in those wars. They actually did a little bit of fighting on the ground. And like we mentioned before, we're going to see a gradual descent into normal, natural life. The very beginning, the welcome into Israel was God's complete control and domination of the situation. He's the one who fought the war in Jericho. And as we proceed and progress to the other wars, we'll see more human involvement. So the beginning belongs to God, and the beginning was done and carried out by God. And as we said, this is also planting the seed for what's going to be in the future when Achan, we'll see in the next time we learn together, he actually took from the spoils and caused a big mess. One more point I just wanted to bring out, and we'll close off tonight, is the prohibition to rebuild Jericho. In verse number 26.
Everything okay?
Yeah, in verse number 26, it says, Vayashba Yehoshua b'esa yilemor. Yehoshua made a vow. Arur ha'ish lifnei Hashem asher yakum uvanai sa'ir azos. Cursed is the man who comes and rebuilds Jericho. He will establish it with his firstborn, and he will raise up its doors with his youngest child. Yehoshua cursed anybody who rebuilds this city that his children should die.
That's right.
So what's the idea here? Why such a strange prohibition? And we will see later in Tanakh, in fact, there was a king who rebuilt Jericho, and sure enough, his children perished. So the Rambam writes, he's quoted by many of the commentaries here, the way that the walls of Jericho came down they didn't come crumbling down and leave a big mess. They have to hire a bunch of dumpsters and get the construction trucks in. They were swallowed into the ground miraculously. They just like
An earthquake.
Yeah, like an earthquake almost. Yeah, the land opened up, walls came like sliding down, like you put your window down in your car, and however, the very top layer of the wall stayed protruded above ground. Why? As a lasting memorial that what's this? How do you get the top layers of the parapet right on top on the ground? This is a lasting memorial of God's miracle that He did in Jericho. So the idea, we wanted this to be around. God clearly wanted this to be a memorial, and he wanted it to stay that way. So we don't want anybody rebuilding this, because this is supposed to be a memorial for God. When humans build cities, they're doing it for their own name, right? You name the city after yourself, after your son. The original builders of cities would name it after their children. I believe even Olney is named after some guy, probably involved with the establishment of Olney. Yeah, cities are to give the human beings a memorial, a lasting namesake, and etc. The Rambam saying, no, this one belongs to God. This is supposed to be God's memorial, like we saw with the spoils of war. They belong to God. So Jericho also should be a memorial for God. Anybody who rebuilds it is trying to erase God's remembrance and make a remembrance for themselves. So what's the punishment? It's measure for measure. His children, which are his legacy, his memorial in this world, they will perish. Because you try to undo God's legacy, so your own will be undone. It's a measure for measure type of thing. And that's the significance of it. You should, as we see, as the Jews entered Israel, they wanted to make lasting memorials of the tremendous divine intervention. They put the stones up from the middle of the Jordan River, and now they're leaving the stones of Jericho there as a lasting memorial to show everybody that even though you're going to go into Israel and it's going to look like just regular farming life, remember that there's a all-powerful God who's on top of it all and controlling it all. That's the idea with the.
But Jericho is a city today.
It is. It was eventually rebuilt, and once it was done, it was done. Once the first person rebuilt it, so he had to pay the dire price of losing his children. But that's it. And then it became a regular city. Yeah, that's that. Next week will be Sukkot, and we have some activities going on in the shul on Thursday, so we won't learn next week together, Yehoshua. But God willing, the following week after Sukkot, we'll be together again. This is going to be like a children's program, Sukkot, in the afternoon. Yeah, you can come just to watch the kids run around. All right. If there's any questions, I'll take them, but that's all I have to say tonight. All right. It's a pleasure learning with you. I would like to wish you a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, Yasher Koach. Be well.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay. Close off. No, you don't do that.